Brilliant. I'm here with Rob Walker, who is the head of global growth for Cognizant.
That's right.
Got that right. It's always good to start with the right job title. Tell us what that means. What does the head of global growth mean?
Well, actually, to be fair, you were almost right. It was global growth markets. So, 80% of the way there. So global growth markets is an odd term. It actually defaults to all of the international business of Cognizant outside of North America.
Yes.
So I'm responsible for our strategy, our growth, and serving our clients across all of our markets in the UK and Ireland, in Europe, Middle East, Far East, India, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand.
So that's actually surprisingly useful for this podcast because it means you can give us a global view on all the topics I'm going to try and cover. And it also means that you live on a plane, so we're very lucky to have you.
I spend quite a bit of time on a plane, yes.
So tell us briefly, well not briefly actually, but take as long as you want. Tell us about the company, Cognizant. What does it do?
Well, I've only been at Cognizant for just over 2 years,
Yeah.
having spent 25 years with another organisation. So I'm still trying to get my arms around the scale of what we do. Loosely, we are a global professional services technology company.
Yeah.
So we're one of the leading companies serving clients and helping them accelerate business outcomes through technology.
Yeah.
And that's a phenomenal opportunity given just how pervasive technology is around fixing some of the world's biggest problems. Technology is at the heart of most things, and that covers obviously lots of geographies we just spoke about, but it covers a multitude of sectors from financial services, healthcare, consumer products, public sector, energy. So it's a hugely exciting opportunity to try and learn how technology impacts in different parts of the world and in different industries and in different clients.
So you cover pretty much every business sector going?
Pretty much, yeah. There's probably not an industry we don't serve somewhere globally.
And how big is Cognizant?
We're just shy of $20 billion, which means we're one of the largest
In revenue?
In revenue.
Yeah.
We're listed in the US, that's why I use dollars as our currency. Crazily, we have just shy of 360,000 people who wake up serving our clients every day. And that means it's almost impossible to get your arms around those number of people.
It's like running the NHS.
Almost, not quite. I think the NHS is probably.
It is bigger.
I think what do they say? The Chinese Army, the Indian Rail Authority, and the NHS are the biggest employers in the world.
Yeah. So 360, and where are they mainly concentrated?
So we're what I would describe as an Indian heritage company. So about 260,000 of those individuals are in India. That's a huge heart of where our talent exists. And the rest sit in all of our geographies. Our single biggest market is North America. That's about 74% of our global revenues. And outside of that, they sit in a multitude of different countries around the world.
And so you spent most of your career at EY.
I did.
What were you doing there?
Well, that's the problem. When you spend almost 25 years at one organisation, you end up doing everything. So I originally started on a graduate program at EY. For my sins, I was an accountant, so I became a chartered accountant. That was partly because when I finished university and I spoke to colleagues and friends, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, as I think many people do when they leave university. And I went into EY because they had this amazing program of training that I just thought was really interesting. And my first client at EY happened to be a technology client, a company called PeopleSoft that was subsequently acquired by Oracle. And I was able to marry two passions, one around sort of finance and others around technology. And I ended up working primarily in the technology sector, or working in technology clients. I spent my first 9 years doing audit, and I spent time in the US, time in Switzerland. And then EY went through a pivot where they re-entered the consulting market. They had sold their business in 2000 to Capgemini and then rebuilt it from 2005 onwards. And I moved and was part of the team that helped rebuild a consulting business for EY. And then I made partner a few years later and did a variety of different roles.
What made you make the leap to Cognizant?
There are a number of different things. One, anyone who is in the big four, which is where EY sits with PwC, KPMG and Deloitte. It's a highly regulated industry.
Yeah.
And that means, rightly, there are some independence issues. That means you are limited as a consultant around working with technology vendors and working in certain clients where, because of separation if you do the audit versus non-audit work. And I felt the industry was moving from a professional services perspective around technology being the primary driver of value for clients. And I looked at Cognizant, and Cognizant obviously is not regulated, we're not an audit client. So we have the opportunity to work with all of the global technology vendors. EY happened to audit AWS, Google, Salesforce, which meant it's quite difficult to go to market with them. And I thought, here's an opportunity to go into...
So you can't sell services to a client that you're auditing.
So you go into a new business where you start with this amazing technology capability, and to see if I could influence that and accelerate the maturity and development of Cognizant was just, it's kind of one of those roles that come on probably once or twice in your career where you just went, you have to kind of take the leap and go, that what an extraordinary opportunity.
So I'm interested in exploring kind of two aspects. One is that you're not a coder, you're not a chief digital officer. Some of the people we've interviewed for season 1, of which you were an honoured guest on season 1 of this podcast, are people who coded, and they tell stories about learning to code when they were sort of 9 or 10. I'm not a coder, by the way, so I'm not being hostile here. But what interests me is how you come to digital transformation. I mean, it's a stunningly obvious point to make, that just because you're a good coder doesn't necessarily mean you're good at digital transformation. But similarly, if you're not kind of au fait with computer technology, for example, is that a challenge when you come to issues like digital transformation? I mean, do you feel, well, you obviously don't feel held back because you've got a massive job, but how do you approach it as a sort of non-computer person? If that doesn't sound too weird a way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of need a combination of things, I think, to in the industry to be successful. Clearly, we have deep technical capabilities around a variety of technologies, be that data, cloud, engineering. And while I'm not a coder, so I can't go really deep into the nuts and bolts and the mechanics, I have spent 25 years working with technology companies and working with clients in and around technology. And the other thing that we need is consultative skills to understand how technology accelerates business outcomes. And I think what I can bring is more of that consultative side of understanding how technology accelerates business outcomes, particularly digital technologies, and also how to run scale technology companies. I mean, that's kind of the background I have with 25 years at EY that I'm bringing into Cognizant. So I think we need both.
Yeah.
And certainly clients, when they buy from Cognizant, are expecting that deep technology technology insight and capabilities, but they also want to be able to put that within an industry context of people who understand the outcomes they're trying to drive from an industry perspective. And I think that's where you have that additional layer of consulting capabilities, which is the bit that I bring.
Because when I was in government and I worked with the government digital service, I think one of the things I learnt that's always stayed with me is that to do technology well, you have to do the kind of analog process alongside it. So I think people often make the mistake of saying digital transformation is about putting your existing processes online, when in fact to make it work, you have to completely unpack the existing processes and reimagine them on the basis that it's all going to be done digitally. Is that fair?
Yeah, I almost agree with that.
Okay, good. We want a bit of disagreement.
And I say I almost agree with it because I think we are going through a huge pivot. I think if you just, historically, and Cognizant grew very successfully by providing capability.
Yeah.
So we provide people with skills to do things, and I think that was the example you would use of digitize my existing process.
Yeah.
The reality is for many businesses, and government and businesses, is that processes arrive at where they are today organically.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't create the processes that exist in most companies today if you were starting from a fresh piece of paper. And I would always start with what outcome are you trying to drive from a client perspective, be that we're trying to do things more efficiently, we're trying to improve customer service, we're trying to improve our customer experience, we're trying to enter new markets. Start with that and then see how technology can accelerate that. And when it comes to processes, my experience, sort of rule of thumb, would say there's probably 25 to a third. I appreciate I'm changing with thirds to percentages, but there's a significant amount that companies can just stop doing because it doesn't drive value. So rather than just take everything in your process and try and digitize it, upgrade it, it's probably about 25% you should just stop doing because it doesn't drive the outcome you're driving. And then you're starting with a simpler way of trying to move from where you are to where you need to be. And then the investment in change, because people who have to change, I think is often underestimated in terms of just the capacity to deliver change into a business. And it's not my expression, but someone said to me, you need to invest as much in silicon, i.e. in technology, as you do in carbon, i.e. in people, in order to make a process or a change stick in a client. And I think where most programs get off track, it's not because of the technology, it's because of the underestimated impact of change in the business.
That's really interesting. And when you say 25% of, you can stop doing 25%, can you give us a kind of real world examples, as it were, of the kind of things clients can stop doing as they do digital transformation? If you
use a simple example, if you're a bank today, historically a lot of your processes would be set up, particularly from a retail bank perspective, around your customers going into a bank and actually speaking to someone across the counter.
With lots of cash.
With lots of cash and lots of processes and lots of paperwork. Most people today will have an expectation of doing things digitally. Not everyone, because we still have people who prefer going into retail outlets. But when you then look at all of the processes that sit behind a bank, all of those manual processes can just be removed. They no longer drive value, and they can be automated in a digital world or from a workflow perspective. That means the experience for the user is a lot better. You can get the information to the individual better. You can make a better decision on whether it's on lending or something else. Or if you look at a mortgage application, most people probably would have applied for a mortgage at some point in their career. There's an awful lot of manual effort that goes into applying for a mortgage. If you think about, could you give me 3 months of bank statements, utility bills, and fill out some spreadsheet about where you think you spend your money, which most people always underestimate how much money they spend on entertainment and clothes and travel.
I have an Excel spreadsheet at home.
Yeah, I'm sure you have every day. But the reality is now, when it comes to a mortgage, all of those records can be digitized. They can, banks can now understand better where you spend your money than where you do, because they have the data to provide that. And all of that can be submitted electronically, which means the process is more accurate and more effective and quicker. So if you can remove and just stop doing that old-fashioned way of mortgage provision, you're making the process far cheaper, far quicker, and better for the individuals, and a better outcome for the bank.
So I was really interested in what you said about skills, and I want to come to skills in a moment, but I just want to focus briefly on the helicopter view of digital transformation in terms of, it's sort of two completely different questions, but I'm going to ask them sort of at the same time. One is, which sectors are kind of transforming most rapidly? And it may be a non-question because everyone's having to do it. Kind of, what is the world going to look like in some of these sectors in 5 years' time? Is one point. So I'd be fascinated in your view on that, because you've got an overview of all these sectors, but also you've got a global view. So which countries? We're used to talking about places like South Korea, Estonia, Singapore as being highly digitized. Are there particular countries that stand out to you where companies or indeed governments are pursuing this process aggressively?
So nice, easy question then. Exactly. Just on world hunger.
You can now talk for 2 hours.
Yeah. So I look at a variety of things. One, digital transformation is happening in every sector at different speeds.
My dinner party line is your supermarket is a digital. Even when you physically walk in, it's all digital.
Completely. So it's It's happening everywhere at slightly different speeds, but every single industry. The global one is really interesting because you've got emerging markets in places like India that are jumping technologies.
That's right. Africa famously went straight to mobile.
Yeah, particularly something like mobile money with M-Pesa in Africa being a great example of actually how you can leap technologies and go to a mobile footprint rather than sort of a more traditional analog or fixed line. So India are doing some really interesting things around insurance and micropayments, which is completely changing the way that digital is impacting industries. And I think that's really fascinating because if you look at a retail environment in India, it's world away from any retail environment we'd have in the West around size of supermarkets and individual stores. But what they're doing around micropayments and digital identification in a large scale country, billion plus people, is probably one of the leading uses of technology. So another example, they're using blockchain around some of their national exchange to verify assets, where you can then trade assets, which is some really interesting adoption of technologies that is going to be absolutely right for India. And I think those markets will create findings that we'll be able to take back in turn to Western economies. There are other, if I was sort of just to particularly talk about the UK in a little bit, because the UK sometimes called out for the economy not performing well, and I'm not saying we've had a great performing economy over the last few years. I think there are a variety of impacts on that, but the underlying assets that the UK has, I think actually puts it in a great position for the next few years. So infrastructure around world-class universities and training institutions, the digital possibilities around things like life sciences or media or technologies and banking. The UK has some of the leading proponents around the creative arts and the way they use technology, or fintechs. That actually, there's a huge amount of opportunity that the UK could leverage if it could unlock that. And I think that's quite exciting. And the UK is more advanced than many parts of Europe around its adoption of cloud technologies. Certainly, it's got a higher stage of development in countries like Germany, which are more manufacturing based. Germany is further behind in terms of transforming its technologies within its industry groups. And actually, I think if the UK can harness some of that, the leading digital service capabilities that the UK could offer the rest of Europe, I think are very exciting. And then there are other areas where I think the UK has pockets where it does things very well around sustainability, and there are other areas where it's miles behind, where it probably does need to do a lot more to unlock further investment.
So, in fact, we're speaking on a particular day. The day of this podcast is irrelevant in many ways because people can listen to it forever. But we are actually on the day that the government has launched a big science and technology strategy and investment in AI. But I think this is great. I can take this clip and send it to the Prime Minister, and it'll cheer him up no end. But the bit I won't send him is the next bit, which is, so where are we behind? Because that's always the most interesting. Where could the government kind of lean in and push things in the UK then?
Yeah, so there are a few things I kind of look at the UK and go, why do we do things that way?
Yeah.
I have some children. One's 19 who's just gone through education, has now gone to university in the US, and I have a daughter who's in her lower 6th year at school. And both of them chose to do IB, International Baccalaureate, rather than A-levels. And they went through GCSEs. And I kind of looked at A-levels and I went, why do we still do A-levels? And I looked at the choices that were available in GCSE and I went, why do we still do GCSEs like that? Why don't we have compulsory subjects around technology? It's so pervasive. And the generation coming into the workforce now is so used to engaging with people digitally, be that on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, you name it. My son has friends because he plays FIFA that he's never spoken to, but he'd consider them really good friends. He's never met them.
He's probably my son.
could well be your son. And so the skills that they need to be successful in the digital economy, a educational structure, particularly around A-levels, that was designed in the 1950s, 1960s, just doesn't meet skill. It doesn't meet the requirements of providing them the skills that we need. So I think we urgently need to change the way that we drive technology into education. There's obviously been recently, again, this will be maybe slightly dated for people who read it in the future, but ChatGPT is clearly the topic that all the papers are talking about right now. And I actually think someone like the IB and even some of the noises coming out of A-levels and GCSEs are rightly saying that this is going to exist, so we need to be able to provide the examples of how do students today use it and understand the pros and cons of using it. Because rote learning and regurgitating facts is not required in modern day business. It's not required for skills that people need to have. You need to be able to understand, how do I interpret data? How do I use it? How do I recognize correct data sets? Where do I validate those? How do I make informed decisions? And I think we need to radically change the way that we are preparing people through the educational system today to give them the digital skills that's necessary to be successful and fully contribute to the business needs that businesses have today.
I mean, we could disappear down a rabbit hole on education because I feel very strongly similar things. I mean, in some ways, I'd get rid of exams entirely. My son is doing GCSEs at the moment, and it is, he's only just tweaked that it is rote learning.
Yeah.
His biology teacher said, I'm a highly qualified research scientist, but I would get 70% in my biology GCSE because I wouldn't be using the right words, and it's a rote learning exercise. And I always think that people who, if you walked into a classroom having been teleported from 1850, it wouldn't look that different.
It would look similar, yeah.
And I think you've got to educate kids with the way they're going to lead their lives, which is on screens using. So you've sort of answered, you've got ahead of yourself, because I always ask people on this podcast, what would you do if you were Prime Minister or Digital Skills Minister for a day on the subject of digital skills? So one thing you've kind of hinted at, but you can expand on it, because this is kind of at the core of this podcast, is, clearly, I wouldn't have a clue how to manage a data set, but I would applaud kind of putting kind of data sets in front of kids. I mean, one of the big obstacles, of course, is whether you get the teachers with the right skills to teach this.
I think it's, but I think teachers are a bit more flexible than you think. I think teachers, you don't go into teaching, frankly, because you want to make a fortune financially.
But they may not know how to mine a data set.
Yeah, but I think teachers do have the ability to learn. I think one of the most important, I think, for anyone in their career is that you're constantly learning throughout all of your career. And I think anyone who's been successful over a sustained period of time always can learn new things and learn new skills. So I think we have an incredible base of teachers here who would embrace new ways of learning that would prepare the students to be more successful in the future. Because I think most teachers go into the industry because they want to be great teachers and they want to be able to prepare
students. So you've revolutionised the classroom. Is there any other stuff you do in terms of digital skills? For example, I mean, you talked about our world-class universities. There's definitely an argument that says, however world-class they are, certainly at Digital Futures, when we train our students, some people, even with computer science degrees, aren't business ready. And I've often thought the link between business and universities needs to become even more porous because business is such a fast-moving environment now.
And look, it's difficult to change 200-year-old institutions.
Yeah.
They rightly don't move very quickly. I think it's both technical skills and soft skills.
Yeah.
If you speak to most people in the industry, it's not that people aren't bright and they don't want to work hard. I actually think most of the generation today want to work as hard as any generation who came to the workforce. But I think there are skills around communication, presentational skills, critical thinking skills that are missing, that I think that either schools currently or universities aren't sufficiently preparing people for. And I think those are really important. Most of the UK is a service-based economy. services by definition means there's a relationship side to it. It's not that you're just manufacturing a widget. You're typically speaking to someone, and the exchange of value becomes on the capabilities you have from a relationship skills perspective. And those relationship skills, those softer skills, and being able to apply the learning you have, be it in technology or numeracy, being able to put it in the context from a relationship perspective is actually the key to unlocking success for people in a workspace.
And I was also really interested in what you said earlier in the conversation about investing in the skills of people who aren't necessarily going to be the technologists, but they're going to be using the technology as the business transforms itself. Can you give us can you bring that alive a bit in terms of what you mean by that? Again, perhaps taking my kind of dinner party example of the supermarket, as the supermarket becomes more digital in terms of the skills or whatever that people have to learn, even though they're not going to be doing the coding or putting in the software or...
Yeah, so if you a good example actually, if you think about the way that any individual has the options of buying food products, or it doesn't have to be food, anything at a supermarket. You can go into a store. You can go into a store in a store, different size stores. You can go online. You can use an app. Various different ways that the channel you choose to buy the things that you buy today. You can also go to the supermarket and buy a phone, buy insurance, buy banking. There's not just typical vegetables. You can do a whole range of different things. If you think about the challenges that supermarkets have, you need traditional people who are really good at buying and driving supply chains and logistics, because you want to get fresh produce not only in a supermarket but also to your customers who choose to buy it online. That means you actually need people who deeply understand supply chain logistics and the flow of all of those, and where those goods comes from globally.
Tomatoes, for example.
Tomatoes, where they come from. Right now, a shortage of fresh fruit, cucumber and tomatoes. Again, to date this podcast for where it was. So that means you need people who understand that process. And importantly, how the technology impacts that process. The other thing your supermarkets will need will be understanding the different ways that people buy and the experience they want to have. And if you're on an app, typically, there's lots of data that a company has on you as an individual. They know what you've bought, they know that what goes with what, and they can provide real-time offers to you to incentivize you to effectively buy more. That's what business is typically about. You want to buy people to buy more of your goods and services. Now that there's a huge flow of data that's available that basically says, right, Ed, what have you bought over the last 3 years? When you buy this, what do you typically buy with it? When was the last time you bought that? What's our experience tell us about how quickly you typically replace that in your basket? Well, if they then provide offers for you in real time that would incentivize you to buy it with them, you're more likely to do that because that's easier for you to consume. It's incredibly valuable for the supermarket and actually valuable for you as a consumer because they will incentivize you typically with an offer to do that. Now that sits on huge amounts of data, often across multiple data sources that needs to be analyzed. And this is where artificial intelligence, machine learning comes in, because you can process these volumes of data and create a unique experience for you. Your experience will be very different to my experience in terms of what's in my basket compared to what's in your basket. So you're putting it in an interface of one from an experience perspective. Now, how do you design that experience? What does the screen look like? Whereabouts does it go? That needs creative experience, as well as data experience, as well as technology experience to understand how to pull that together. Those are really quite hard things to do.
Really hard, especially if you've been doing it for 20 years in a previous environment.
If you typically have been putting it in a retail environment where you put things on an end of shelf, and don't quite know why things move the way they do, or the trade investments you get from consumer product companies. I mean, that's the power of data, really, and using the example you created.
Can I ask you a slightly random question, which doesn't fit into the flow of this conversation, but it's a bit of a cliche that government doesn't do IT well. What do you think is the difference between doing digital transformation for a supermarket and doing digital transformation for a government service, why does it always seem to cost much more than it was meant to, and never quite work? Maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe it works. Well, again, the government digital service I thought did an amazing job in terms of some of the services it transformed. But government does have this reputation. Probably governments all over the world.
Yeah, it's. I mean, corporates also can mess things up as well as government can as well. I think there's a few things that are the difference. One, businesses can be a bit more ruthless than governments around deciding when to stop and start things. And governments don't always have the opportunity to shut things off as quickly as corporates will if they're not working. So that is available for corporates. I also think corporates typically have a bigger talent pool to pick from, and therefore the skills they have access to, be those onshore or offshore, are greater. And at the end of the day, you need the skills and talents to drive transformation. I also think corporates generally are better at turning things off, so stopping legacy. One of the big issues I think most governments have, and corporates have it to a certain extent, but particularly governments, is you don't ever stop doing something. You just add layers of complexity to things, and that can be a problem because you just make things more complicated rather than simpler. I am encouraged by some of the digital work that some of the central government functions are doing, where they're simplifying the procurement process, they're driving shorter sprints, being a bit more agile in the way that they're driving work, and I think that will be really useful in the future. And I think the government need to keep on driving digital simplification. But unfortunately, there is a lot of failed programs on the government side where the promise of big, large-scale programs never quite realise the benefits that were envisaged at the beginning.
Okay, well, let's finish on success, because you and I both watched the Grand Prix on television. Again, dating this podcast, Aston Martin came third with the oldest driver in Formula One, Fernando Alonso. The key point, of course, is that Aston Martin is sponsored by Cognizant. Tell us about your relationship with Aston Martin. Yeah,
we are the title sponsors for the Aston Martin Formula One team, and we're in our third year of doing that. And it's been an extraordinary relationship. I've met Lawrence Stroll, who's the owner of Aston Martin Formula One, and he's a sports fan. I mean, he's a big fan of Formula One, and clearly he has an incentive. He wants his son to be successful. But when we first approached him, he said his son is a driver, one of the drivers, and when we first reached out to him just over 2 years ago, he said, "I'm on a 5-year journey. I would like to make Aston Martin a championship-winning team," and that was an extraordinary statement, because for folks who are familiar with Formula One, it's historically been dominated by the big three teams of Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari, and they spend more money than any other company. They were miles ahead of the pack, and Aston Martin finished 7th in the Constructors' Champion last year. But Lawrence has this vision of where he wanted to take the company, and a lot of it is the application of technology. Actually, what makes a Formula One car goes fast is the aerodynamic setup. Some of it is the power chain and the way, but it's really about 95% of what makes a car go quick is about the way the air flows over the car. And clearly, Lawrence has hired some brilliant people from industry. He hired Dan Fellows, who was number 2 in Red Bull, who's made a big difference around the technology aerodynamic setup. But what we've been doing is helping Aston Martin manage data. So each car, I don't know the precise number, has almost 300 sensors on it that's recording data every single second that car's going around a track. So you multiply that over a race time or a testing time, you have billions and billions and billions of data points. So you have to be able to take that and understand what the data is telling you, and then figure out how to apply improvements on the car. And what we've been doing with them is helping them with the flow of the data and the governance about how it goes through different engineering setups in the within their company, and how they can reuse that data using artificial intelligence and machine learning to effectively get the enhancements and upgrades on the car more quickly. And look, I'm not going to pretend that it's most of it is the hard work of amazing engineering setup and engineers at Silverstone of Aston Martin, but it's fantastic to be deeply connected with a team who have gone from the back of the grid to the front of the grid. And it's why yesterday was so rewarding, because obviously to see the Aston Martin Cognizant car podium in the opening race yesterday, knowing what the team have gone through, is just a tremendous sense of achievement. And you have a lot of vicarious pleasure, because you know how important it is to those teams. And Formula One is this crazy sport, which is every 2 weeks where you have a race, all of your efforts are available for the public to be able to point out. They know precisely whether you finished first, second, third, fourth, fifth, or 20th. And around a 3.5 mile race circuit, which can take, 1 minute 40 or something like that, the difference between being first or being 10th is half a second. And the margins are so small, so any enhancement that technology can give you is the difference between you being 17th or 3rd. And I guess that's could be able to contribute to that, and showcasing how we apply technology in probably the most demanding sporting environment that exists on the planet is great fun to be part of.
Brilliant. Well, Rob Walker, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
Good.